On November 2, 1942, German 6th Army intelligence officers at Stalingrad compiled their daily assessment of Soviet capabilities. The report was distributed to General Friedrich Paulus and forwarded to Army Group headquarters. It concluded that Soviet forces facing the 6th Army possessed no operational reserves available for offensive action. The assessment was methodical. Reconnaissance had tracked Soviet deployments for weeks. Radio intercepts provided unit identifications. Aerial observation showed defensive positions but no concentration areas, suggesting offensive preparation. The intelligence summary stated that while Soviet forces maintained defensive strength, they lacked the reserves, logistics, and coordination necessary for major counteroffensive operations. 17 days later, on November 19, 1942, at 0700 hours, 1 million Soviet soldiers attacked from 3 directions simultaneously: 10 Soviet armies, 900 tanks, 13,500 artillery pieces, 3 entire fronts coordinated in one of the largest encirclement operations in military history. Within 4 days, the German 6th Army, 290,000 soldiers, was completely surrounded at Stalingrad. The force that German intelligence assessed as incapable of offensive action had positioned 1 million men for a double envelopment while German reconnaissance watched. This was not lucky timing or sudden improvisation. The Soviets had been moving forces into position for 6 weeks. 1 million soldiers, thousands of vehicles, entire tank corps relocated hundreds of kilometers. All while German aerial reconnaissance photographed the same sectors daily. All while signals intelligence monitored Soviet radio networks. All while frontline units reported no significant changes in enemy dispositions. The deception that enabled Operation Uranus represented systematic concealment at a scale that should not have been physically possible. Yet German intelligence detected none of it until Soviet tanks appeared, where assessment maps showed empty steppe. Standard German reconnaissance doctrine in 1942 was sophisticated. Luftwaffe aerial observation units photographed Soviet rear areas systematically. Intelligence officers analyzed sequential photographs to detect troop movements, supply buildups, and changes in defensive positions. Radio intercepts identified unit locations through transmission patterns and signal strength. Forward observers tracked visible Soviet activity and reported any unusual movements. The system had worked throughout 1941 and early 1942, providing German commanders with generally accurate assessments of enemy capabilities. The scale of what needed concealment made detection seem inevitable. Moving 1 million soldiers required massive logistics. Each Soviet army required hundreds of trucks for supplies. Tank corps needed fuel convoys. Artillery units required ammunition transport. Radio communications coordinated movement across hundreds of kilometers. The physical signatures of a military concentration, vehicle tracks, supply dumps, and command posts created patterns visible from reconnaissance altitude. German intelligence officers understood these patterns. They knew what offensive preparation looked like. Concentration areas showed increased vehicle density. Supply dumps appeared in aerial photographs as geometric arrangements of material. Radio traffic increased as units coordinated movements. Defensive positions were abandoned or thinned as forces redeployed. These signatures were what reconnaissance specifically searched for. Finding them was the entire purpose of intelligence collection. Critics argued that hiding an offensive of 1 million soldiers was impossible. The German 6th Army itself numbered 290,000 troops, and its presence at Stalingrad was obvious to everyone. How could Soviet forces assemble a force 3 times larger without creating similar signatures? The mathematics seemed to defy concealment. 1 million soldiers eating 3 meals daily required thousands of tons of food. Moving that food required truck convoys visible from aircraft. Concealing the trucks required camouflage efforts that would themselves be visible. The physical constraints appeared absolute. Reconnaissance aircraft could photograph 500 square kilometers per sortie. The Stalingrad sector was under regular observation. Any significant force concentration would appear in sequential photographs as changes in terrain patterns, new vehicle tracks, or altered defensive positions. German photo interpretation units were trained to detect exactly these changes. They examined photographs systematically, comparing current images against previous coverage to identify alterations. Yet between October and mid-November 1942, as 1 million Soviet soldiers moved into jumping-off positions north and south of Stalingrad, German intelligence detected no concentration threatening the Sixth Army's flanks. The November 2nd assessment reflected genuine analytical confidence. Intelligence officers had examined the evidence available to them and reached conclusions that seemed warranted by that evidence. The assessment was not negligent, it was wrong. Soviet planning for Operation Uranus began in September 1942, while fighting inside Stalingrad consumed German attention. Marshal Zhukov and General Vasilevsky designed a double envelopment that targeted Romanian forces holding extended flanks north and south of the German Sixth Army. The concept was operationally sound, but it required assembling overwhelming force without alerting German intelligence. This meant moving 10 armies into position while German reconnaissance flew daily, and signals intelligence monitored communications. The solution was doctrine. Soviet operational security procedures, refined through bitter experience in 1941, treated concealment as systematic discipline rather than improvisation. Every unit moving towards Stalingrad received identical instructions. All movement occurred during darkness. No movement during daylight hours. No exceptions. Units halted before dawn and remained stationary until after sunset. This absolute prohibition on daylight movement formed the foundation of the entire deception. Enforcement was rigid. Officers who violated movement restrictions faced immediate removal. Units detected moving during daylight were punished regardless of justification. The prohibition extended to individual vehicles. A single truck moving on a road during daylight could compromise an entire army's concealment. Soviet military police established checkpoints on every approach route, turning back any vehicle attempting daylight movement. The scale of coordination required was unprecedented. 1 million soldiers do not move as a single mass. They move as thousands of smaller units, each requiring routes, schedules, and destinations. Soviet staff officers planned movement in exhaustive detail. Each rifle division received march tables specifying departure times, routes, rest positions, and arrival coordinates. Artillery units moved separately with different routes to avoid congestion. Tank corps, requiring fuel at regular intervals, followed paths with supply points positioned in advance. Movement began in early October, 6 weeks before the attack. Units departed their current positions after nightfall, marched through darkness, and concealed themselves before dawn. March distances were calculated to allow units to reach designated hide positions before first light. Routes avoided population centers where civilians might observe and report movements. Where possible, forces used secondary roads invisible from reconnaissance altitude or moved cross-country to avoid creating road traffic visible in aerial photographs. Concealment during daylight required systematic camouflage. Soviet forces positioned themselves in forests, ravines, and depressions that offered natural overhead cover. Vehicles were dispersed to prevent concentration signatures. Camouflage netting covered equipment that could not be hidden by terrain. Troops remained in concealed positions throughout daylight. Nighttime movement was the only time units moved. They emerged only after dark to continue movement or to conduct necessary activities. Radio silence was absolute during movement phases. Soviet communications discipline prohibited radio transmissions except on specifically authorized networks. Units moving into position maintained complete radio silence. No tactical communications, no administrative traffic. There were no transmissions of any kind that German signals intelligence could intercept and use to track force movements. Command and control operated through couriers and landline telephone systems that left no radio signature. The radio deception extended beyond silence. Soviet signals units maintained normal radio traffic patterns in sectors forces were leaving. Radio operators remained behind when combat units departed, transmitting routine traffic that suggested continued presence. Dummy headquarters transmitted administrative communications at normal intervals. The radio signature that German intelligence monitored showed no significant changes, even as entire armies relocated hundreds of kilometers. Assembly areas required equal discipline. Forces concentrating north and south of Stalingrad dispersed across dozens of separate positions rather than forming visible concentration areas. Each army occupied multiple sectors, with units separated by kilometers. This dispersion prevented the dense concentration signatures that aerial reconnaissance detected easily. German photo interpreters seeing these sectors would observe forces consistent with defensive deployments, not offensive assembly. Supply operations posed an acute challenge. 1 million soldiers required thousands of tons of supplies every day. Moving this material forward without creating visible supply dumps or vehicle traffic required systematic concealment at every stage. Soviet logistics officers established supply points in forested areas offering overhead concealment. Convoys moved only during darkness, on predetermined routes. Supplies were dispersed immediately upon arrival, rather than stockpiled in central dumps that would appear in aerial photographs. The effort extended to unit behavior. Soviet forces maintaining defensive positions in sectors adjacent to assembly areas continued normal defensive routines. Patrols operated on regular schedules. Artillery fired routine defensive missions. All activity was designed to suggest business as usual. German frontline units observing these sectors reported defensive activity matching previous patterns. Nothing suggested forces on the other side were preparing major offensive operations.